It was just past 6 on a grey Thursday morning when the normally quiet Wellington barracks began to stir. The remnants of the previous night's rain hung in the air, leaving the scent of damp stone and leather that only those familiar with early mornings in the military could understand. The guardsmen moved with practiced precision, not yet fully awake but walking with the rhythm of men who were trained to be silent before breakfast. Inside the preparation room, Corporal William Hartley sat alone on a wooden bench. His head was slightly bowed as he polished his boots, his movements slow and methodical. He was 35, a man built like stone, hard, strong, and unyielding. His nickname among the other guardsmen was Silent Will, a title earned over years of serving with the Coldstream Guards. Will had already seen things many men would never dream of. He'd once jumped out of an aircraft over the harsh terrain of Helmand Province, where a war took the life of his brother, Lieutenant Arthur Hartley, who had worn pips on his shoulder. Now, years after that loss, Will carried the grief quietly. He didn't wear it on his sleeve, just like he didn't wear his emotions openly. He'd learned to carry the weight of sorrow, loss, and duty with the same unspoken precision that defined his every move. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video. His moment of peace was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mail, a voice called from the hallway. Special courier. Will looked up, his expression unreadable. An officer entered holding a cream-colored envelope. Will noticed the royal cipher in the corner, the unmistakable mark of something significant, something not meant for casual handling. The officer handed it to him with a neutral expression, and Will took it, wiped his hands on his trousers, and opened it with deliberate care. Inside was a formal summons to appear at Southern Crown Court. His appearance was required in relation to an allegation of excessive force. The words didn't register immediately, but his eyes locked onto the date. The incident had happened 3 weeks ago at St. James' Palace. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing his mind to wander back to that day. A man had been gripping a woman's wrist outside the palace, and the woman's eyes had silently pleaded for help. Will had stepped forward, calm and measured, not shouting or creating a scene. He had simply told the man to let go. When the man resisted, Will had used a wrist control technique, a standard procedure he had learned during basic training. The situation had been diffused in minutes, the woman mouthing a silent thank you as she disappeared into the crowd. That should have been the end of it, but apparently, it wasn't. Will folded the letter carefully and placed his boots side by side beneath the bench. His face as emotionless as ever. He didn't react. Not a twitch of the jaw, not a blink too fast. But those around him, young guardsmen lacing up their gaiters and brushing down their tunics, noticed the shift. The atmosphere in the room subtly changed. Everything all right, Corp? One of them asked. Will nodded once, his eyes still on the letter. Court date, he said simply. The room went silent. Whispers began to circulate, some calling it a joke, others a disgrace. But no one dared ask Will again. Those who knew him understood that when he wasn't speaking, he was preparing. And by the time the sun set, his uniform was already pressed and perfect, his bare skin resting in the corner of the room like a silent sentinel. Will, however, said nothing. The next morning, he would stand in a courtroom, not as a witness, but as a man on trial. The morning was cold and damp, and the steps outside Southern Crown Court gleamed with the early morning drizzle. The presence of photographers milling about and adjusting their lenses spoke to the curiosity surrounding the case. The story of a royal guardsman being accused of assault, especially one ordered to appear in full ceremonial uniform, had stirred intrigue among the press. Even the most seasoned journalists had left their usual haunts to capture the spectacle. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Spectators filed in early, some law students, others members of the local press, and a few civilians drawn by the unusual nature of the trial. There was a buzz of whispered conversation as everyone speculated about the royal guard accused of assaulting a civilian. Some sympathized with Will, while others took sides with the plaintiff, Lucas Dre. The murmurs of the crowd grew quieter when the doors opened at precisely 9:15 a.m. Corporal William Hartley entered the courtroom, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were still on parade. He was tall, and the black bear skin he wore added another 18 inches to his frame, making him seem even more imposing. His tunic was perfectly pressed, every brass button gleaming. His boots shone like mirrors, and his face remained impassive. He carried no documents in his hands and said nothing. He simply walked to the defendant's table and stood. A hush fell over the room. The spectators seemed to hold their collective breath. To some, Will appeared like a statue, silent, unmoving, and impervious to the world around him. The prosecutor, Elliot Dean, a tall, lean man with prematurely silver hair, leaned back in his chair and sighed theatrically. He whispered something to his assistant, too quietly for anyone else to hear, but his disdain was evident. "He thinks the red coat makes him untouchable," he murmured. At the plaintiff's table, Lucas Dre, the complainant, sat smugly, dressed in an expensive designer suit. His eyes flicked between the crowd and the proceedings, more focused on the attention he was receiving than on the trial itself. His legal team, 2 solicitors and a junior barrister, were busy tapping away on their tablets, nodding in agreement to Dre's every word. A junior officer from Will's unit, Second Lieutenant Rory Davis, had quietly taken a seat in the back of the room. He looked uncomfortable, unsure whether he should stand in salute or remain seated in support. His gaze remained fixed on Will, who stood at the defense table with the same quiet resolve that had defined his entire military career. The court officers whispered as they checked their notes, confirming the proper pronunciation of Coldstream. The formalities continued, but there was an underlying tension that everyone could feel. Then, the Clare announced, "All rise." And the courtroom stood as Justice Caroline Hale entered, brisk and efficient as always. But as soon as she caught sight of Will standing at the defendant's table, something changed. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes flicking back to the docket in her hand. She blinked, once, then again, more slowly this time. Her lips parted slightly, as though to say something, but no words came. For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. The judge was frozen, her gaze never leaving the man in front of her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered the docket, stepped fully behind the bench, and continued to stare at Will. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter than usual. "Be seated," she said. The room settled into an eerie silence. But something had changed. Justice Hale's posture was different, there was a slight softness to her, an almost imperceptible shift in her authority. The Clare, confused, cleared her throat. "Shall we proceed, Your Honor?" she asked. Justice Hale nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on Will, and for the first time, her gaze seemed to carry more than just formality. There was something personal, something deeper in it. The prosecution began its case with a forceful statement, accusing Will of using the weight of ceremonial tradition as a weapon against a civilian. The prosecutor, Elliot Dean, spoke sharply, his voice dripping with contempt for the idea that someone in Will's position could act beyond the rules, simply because of the uniform he wore. As the prosecution presented its argument, Justice Hale remained silent, but her attention was riveted on Will, still standing perfectly still in his ceremonial uniform. Dean's words seemed to bounce off him, the guardsman unflinching in his calm. Will's defense lawyer, Mark Rawlings, a military-appointed solicitor, stood next. "Corporal Hartley will testify directly," she said, and the court reluctantly shifted its focus to the defendant. Will moved at last. He removed his bearskin hat with methodical care and placed it gently on the table before him. The quiet scrape of his boots on the stone floor echoed in the courtroom as he stepped forward. When the oath was administered, Will responded in a calm, even tone to each question. When he reached the moment to speak about the incident, the room fell silent once more. He described the day in question, a rainy Thursday with tourists gathered near the fountain at St. James' Palace. He'd seen a woman, distressed and visibly upset, standing near the rail. A man had been gripping her wrist tightly, and she had said, "Please let go," twice. Will had stepped forward, identified himself, and calmly told the man to release the woman's arm. The man, instead of complying, had squared up to Will and said, "Mind your bloody business." When the man shoved him, Will responded with a wrist control hold, a technique taught to him during his training. Will held the man until security arrived. Rawlings asked if he had threatened the man, raised his voice, or done anything beyond what he described. Will's answer was simple, no. Rawlings then asked him why he believed his actions had been justified. Will's answer came without hesitation, because the person being hurt didn't have the voice to make it stop, he said. So I lent her mine. The room remained eerily still as Elliot Dean, the prosecutor, stood up to cross-examine Will. His approach was sharp, his voice rising with each question, as if to strip away any last shred of nobility from the man standing before him. His first question was pointed and direct. "Let's imagine for a moment that you weren't in uniform, Corporal Hartley. That you were just a man on the street, wearing jeans. Would you still have intervened in the same way?" Without hesitation, Will's calm voice answered, "Yes." Dean pressed on. "So, you believe it's your role to intervene in civilian matters? To step into situations that don't concern you?" Will's expression didn't change. "When someone's being hurt, yes," he said quietly. "I don't consider that a matter of uniform or station. It's a matter of what's right." The prosecutor's lip curled in disdain. "So, in your view, you're some sort of judge, jury, and executioner now?" His tone dripped with mockery. "No," Will responded, his voice even. "But I'm not an observer either." Dean wasn't satisfied. He pushed harder, voice rising as he accused Will of stepping far beyond his role, of acting like a vigilante. "You weren't ordered to act. You weren't authorized to detain anyone. You were supposed to stand still and keep your mouth shut, weren't you? That's what the guard does. Isn't that the job?" Will's eyes shifted, a brief flicker of resolve in them. "Sometimes standing still is duty," he said firmly. "And sometimes it's cowardice." The prosecutor paused. There was a stir in the gallery as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Will had just made his stance clear. He was not bound by tradition when someone's safety was at risk. Dean, though not flustered, grew more intense. "So, silence, then. You believe silence is what? A choice?" His tone suggested he was trying to trap Will into saying something he could use against him. Will's response was slow and deliberate. "I've stood silent at funerals. I've stood silent in front of crowds throwing slurs. I have mastered silence. But that day..." He paused briefly. Silence would have been complicity. There was a quiet, almost reverent pause after Will's words. Even the prosecutor didn't immediately speak, instead shuffling papers aimlessly as if distracted. Rawlings, Will's defense lawyer, let the silence settle in the room before asking her next question, which was simple but effective. "Do you believe your actions were justified?" "Yes," Will said, his voice calm but resolute. The prosecutor stood up again, visibly frustrated. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, his tone clipped. The courtroom sat still for a moment after Will's testimony, the tension hanging thick in the air. It was then that something unexpected happened. Someone in the gallery stood up, a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair and a brown coat, raised her hand slightly, holding an umbrella in the other. She hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Her voice was soft but steady, and the room went silent as all eyes turned toward her. Justice Hale raised an eyebrow, glancing at Dean and then back to the woman. "You are not on the witness list," she said, her tone polite but firm. The woman replied confidently, "I wasn't asked to be. But I was there that day." The gallery shifted in their seats as whispers began to spread. Could this be someone connected to the case? Was she an eyewitness? Justice Hale looked to Dean, who appeared caught off guard but said nothing, his earlier smirk replaced with a tight expression. After a brief pause, Justice Hale gave a single nod. "You may speak." The woman stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking lightly on the stone floor as she made her way to the front. She stood beside the witness box but did not enter it, as if respecting the formality of the court while still speaking her truth. "I didn't know there would be a trial," she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight that resonated throughout the room. "I didn't even know he had gotten into trouble for what he did. I wasn't going to come, but when I read about it in the papers and saw the pictures, they made it sound like he was the aggressor, like he caused harm. That's not what happened." She paused for a moment and then glanced at Will, her gaze softening. "Lucas Dre is not my partner. He's someone who had been following me for weeks." I told him no. I said it politely. I said it loudly. But he wouldn't stop. That day, he found me by chance near the palace and grabbed me when I tried to walk away. I was afraid. Her voice tightened slightly but remained composed. He was hurting me, not badly, no bruises, but enough that I was afraid, and no one did anything. People watched, no one said a word. Except him. She gestured toward Will. The room remained still, the weight of her words sinking in. She continued, her tone unwavering. "He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't humiliate him. He just stepped in and made it stop. I didn't need a police report. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to feel safe. And for those 5 minutes, I did. Because of him." A heavy silence followed her testimony. The tension in the room shifted, and even the prosecutor seemed temporarily at a loss. Elliot Dean, clearly annoyed, rose to his feet. "Miss Colton, I must remind you that this court requires objectivity. Personal gratitude, no matter how sincere, cannot substitute proper protocol." The woman did not flinch. "Then maybe protocol needs adjusting," she replied, her voice still steady but carrying a note of challenge. The gallery murmured, but Justice Hale raised her hand, silencing the room. "Thank you, Miss Colton," she said softly, acknowledging the woman's brave stand. Miss Colton nodded once, her eyes meeting Will's in silent acknowledgement before returning to her seat, and just like that, the case had shifted, not in a dramatic twist or legal maneuver, but in a way that felt deeper, truer. The truth had found its voice. The courtroom fell into a hush as Justice Hale returned from chambers, precisely 33 minutes after the final word had been spoken. The room stood again as she entered, and even Lucas Dre, who had been fidgeting for most of the trial, sat still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Be seated," Justice Hale said in a voice that was measured, devoid of drama, but carrying undeniable authority. She glanced at the prosecution, then at the defense, before her eyes finally settled on Will. The room held its breath. She began, "This court has reviewed the evidence and testimony provided. We have heard from the defense, the complainant, and from a previously absent but material eyewitness." She gave a brief nod to Miss Colton, who sat quietly in the gallery. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video. There is no CCTV footage of the incident, no prior record of misconduct on the part of Corporal Hartley, and no visible injury sustained by Mr. Dre. No police complaint was filed until after media attention presented an opportunity. The court finds the complainant's motivations questionable at best. Justice Hale paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. The defendant's conduct, while outside the strict ceremonial remit of his duty, falls firmly within the bounds of reasonable intervention. The case is dismissed. There was no applause, no gasps, just a collective exhale from the courtroom. The tension lifted, and even the prosecutor, Dean, closed his folder with a little more respect than when he had first opened it. Justice Hale, however, wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses, a gesture that signified something more personal. Before we adjourn, she began, her voice softer now, almost reflective, "I'd like to speak to the court, not as a judge, but as a mother." The courtroom stilled. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. Justice Hale took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely, and the silence now was thick with anticipation, almost as if the weight of her words would change everything that had come before. 12 years ago, she began, her voice steady but filled with an emotion she didn't try to hide. My son was stationed with the Royal Engineers in Helmand Province. He was part of a routine convoy that was ambushed on the return to Camp Bastion. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair as her voice didn't falter but carried the weight of a deep, personal grief. My son was in the 3rd lorry. It was hit, and he was trapped under the debris. His unit was pinned down. He survived only because a paratrooper disobeyed an order and ran through enemy fire to pull him out. She paused for a moment, her expression unreadable, but the emotion in her eyes was unmistakable. That soldier, she continued, her voice softening, was Lieutenant Arthur Hartley. A quiet man who didn't ask for recognition, a man who made a choice not to stand still, even though it was against orders. He ran through that enemy fire and saved my son. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the realization hit everyone present. Will Hartley's brother had been the soldier who saved the judge's son, an act of courage that ultimately cost him his life, as he died 2 days later from the wounds sustained in that rescue. Justice Hale's voice caught slightly as she finished. I never got to thank him. Not in person, not even in a letter. He died before I could express my gratitude. Her eyes lifted from the bench and locked onto Will, who remained as still and calm as ever, his gaze unwavering. But when I saw your name, Mr. Hartley, when I saw you stand before me in that uniform, it hit me. It was like cold water. I remembered that name, and I remembered what it cost. Will's expression remained composed, but something about the moment was raw, and his eyes softened for just an instant as he met hers. There was no need for further words. Justice Hale, her voice barely a whisper now, said with finality, the name Hartley does not deserve to stand accused in my courtroom. The entire courtroom held its breath as Justice Hale leaned back slightly. The weight of her words still hanging in the air. She didn't make a dramatic gesture, no pound of the gavel, no grand flourish. Her gaze remained fixed on Will as if she was still trying to read him, to understand him. There was an eerie, profound stillness as she began to speak again, her tone clear and decisive. The court has reviewed the evidence presented, and after much consideration, I find that the case against Corporal William Hartley is without merit. She paused briefly before continuing. The complainant, Mr. Dre, has no visible injuries, and his accusations, brought only after media attention, lack substantial credibility. The evidence we have seen today suggests that Mr. Dre's actions were far more egregious than the defendant's, who acted in accordance with his duty to protect an innocent person. Justice Hale's gaze never wavered from Will's as she finished, the case is dismissed. A wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Those who had been sympathetic to Will's situation let out quiet breaths, while even some of the spectators who had been uncertain about the case seemed to settle into a peaceful calm. The tension that had permeated the trial from the very beginning had dissipated. Replaced by an almost sacred sense of justice, Elliot Dean, the prosecutor, closed his folder with a finality that suggested he knew when to back down. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last-ditch effort. He simply gathered his papers and nodded, his face showing a begrudging respect for the decision. Justice Hale stood, signaling the end of the hearing. This hearing is closed, she said softly, but the gravity of her words lingered in the room. The courtroom began to empty, but there was no rush, no chaos. Instead, people moved slowly, almost reverently. They had witnessed something rare, a moment where justice wasn't just about the law, it was about truth, legacy, and understanding. Will Hartley remained seated, unmoving as the gallery slowly emptied. He hadn't spoken a word since the verdict, his body still dressed in the full ceremonial uniform. His bare skin hat rested in his lap, the epitome of composure. He wasn't seeking approval. He wasn't waiting for applause. He had done his duty. The quiet dignity of the moment was enough for him. As the last few people exited the room, the sound of Will's boots echoed softly against the marble floor, marking his departure from the courtroom. But as he made his way toward the door, he heard a familiar rhythm behind him, a set of deliberate footsteps. Will turned just as Justice Hale approached him in the corridor. She had removed her robes, her hair slightly windswept, her expression no longer one of a judge, but a woman who had seen too much and felt too deeply. "Just a moment, Corporal Hartley," she said, her voice calm but filled with a different energy now, one that came from understanding. Will came to attention without a word. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in the trial, there was a flicker of recognition, not just of duty, but of something more human. "I meant what I said in there," Justice Hale began, her voice quiet. "I never thanked your brother. I should have. I tried to once, but the letter I wrote didn't feel enough." She looked at him, her expression steady but with a touch of something softer. Will didn't speak, but his eyes softened ever so slightly. He had never expected thanks, not in the way she meant. He had known duty, honor, and sacrifice from the start. Yet in that moment, the weight of what she was offering seemed to lift something in him. "No," he said quietly, his voice steady but with a hint of something almost warm, "he never expected thanks." Justice Hale nodded, her gaze never leaving him. "No, but sometimes we still need to give it, for ourselves," she said softly. "I spent so many years in rooms like this, calling names, reading charges. It becomes routine. But today, I heard a name and remembered what it cost. Your brother's sacrifice, your service, it reminds me what true dignity looks like." She took a step back, adjusting her coat as she prepared to leave. Then, she paused again and looked him in the eye. "If the guard ever puts you on trial again," she said, her voice quieter but filled with sincerity, "call me as a witness." Will's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Understood, ma'am," he replied with a quiet nod. She gave him one final nod, then turned to leave. As her footsteps echoed down the corridor, Will watched her go. He stood there for a moment, his figure unchanging, then turned toward the heavy courthouse doors. There was no rush. No need for approval. The rain had stopped outside, and the world continued to move around him, but for Will Hartley, his duty was done. He had stood for what was right, and he was ready to continue forward, undeterred by the world's expectations or judgments. He stepped out into the London drizzle, boots clicking against the stone, moving with the same measured precision he had shown all his life. Some men don't need applause to know they've done right. Sometimes, walking forward is the only statement they need. As Will stepped out of the courthouse, the London drizzle had picked up again, the steady rain falling lightly but persistently. The streets bustled with the usual rhythm of city life, taxi cabs honking, tourists snapping photos of the iconic buildings, and pedestrians hurrying along with their umbrellas. Yet, to Will, the world seemed distant, as if he were moving through a different space entirely. His boots struck the wet stone with a quiet, measured sound, a rhythm that only he seemed to fully understand. He didn't hurry, didn't glance around for acknowledgement or validation. There was no need. He had already fulfilled his duty, not just as a soldier, but as a man who stood for what was right when others might have looked away. He didn't need applause, didn't need recognition. His sense of duty, his sense of honor, were all he required. As Will walked, he became aware of the quiet reflection settling in his mind. He had gone into that courtroom expecting to face judgment, but instead, he had been shown a side of the world that few could see, one where duty and sacrifice were tied to legacies that carried the weight of history. His brother's name had not just been a reminder of service, it was a testament to a life given for something greater than oneself. It was the same kind of quiet commitment that defined Will's own life, that silent, unwavering dedication to the things that truly mattered. His thoughts wandered to the woman in the brown coat, Miss Colton, whose testimony had shifted the course of the trial. She had spoken not from a place of anger or vengeance, but from truth, her truth, a quiet acknowledgement of the way Will had stepped in when no one else did. In that moment, she had become not just a witness but a symbol of the kind of bravery that, too often, went unspoken. Will's own silence had been a shield, a choice to act without drawing attention to himself. He had lent his voice to the woman when she had none. And in doing so, he had shown what true courage meant. Not standing out, not performing for the crowds, but standing firm and doing what was necessary, even when the world didn't ask. As Will walked further away from the courthouse, his steps growing slower as he made his way toward the edge of the city. He couldn't shake the memory of Justice Hale's words. The connection she had made between his brother and herself, it lingered in the air like an unspoken truth, a bond forged in the fires of war and sacrifice. Justice Hale had spoken not as a judge, but as a mother, one who had seen the sacrifices made and felt the weight of what it meant to lose a child in service. Her son had been saved by Will's brother, and in that moment, she had seen not just a soldier in front of her, but a reflection of everything her own son had once stood for. It was a reminder that duty had no boundaries. It wasn't limited to military ranks or ceremonial positions. It transcended that. Will's brother had acted outside the orders given to him, risking his life to save another, just as Will had done when he stepped forward at St. James' Palace. Legacy, Will realized, was not just a matter of blood, it was about the choices made in moments that required action, courage, and strength. His brother's legacy was one of quiet valor, the same quiet valor Will embodied in everything he did. And now, he too would carry that legacy with him, silently and without fanfare, but with a sense of deep conviction. Will couldn't help but feel a certain peace in that, peace in knowing that. In the end, legacy wasn't about the awards or recognition. It was about the small moments, the acts of bravery and compassion, that defined who a person truly was. And as long as he carried the name Hartley, he would carry that legacy with honor, whether or not anyone else saw it. Will had reached the edge of the city by now, where the buzz of urban life faded into the background, and the quiet of the streets began to settle in. He stood for a moment, looking out over the city as it continued its frenetic pace. Life was always moving forward, whether one was ready for it or not. And that was exactly what Will intended to do, move forward. He had done his part. The trial, the court, the accusations, it was all behind him now. What remained was his own path, and it was one that required him to walk it with the same silent resolve he had always carried. Nothing would change that. As Will adjusted the strap of his ceremonial rifle, preparing to continue on his way, he felt a quiet, steady confidence in himself. There would always be more trials, more challenges to face. Life never stopped, never slowed down. But as he had shown in the courtroom, and as he had shown time and again throughout his life, some men did not need the approval of others to know they had done what was right. The soft drizzle continued to fall, but Will didn't flinch. He simply walked forward, head held high, boots steady with each step. There would be no more glances back, no more searching for validation. He had made his stand, and now it was time to keep moving forward, just as he had always done. In the distance, the sound of a London taxi honked, a reminder that life carried on around him. But Will's path was his own. And with every step he took, his legacy, his brother's legacy, moved with him, silently and with honor. The world didn't need to notice. He didn't need the applause. For Will Hartley, walking forward was the only statement he ever needed to make. Will continued his deliberate pace through the streets of London, each step cutting through the quiet like a steady rhythm. The rain had turned to a light mist, and the world around him seemed to blur into soft, muted colors. The sounds of the city were distant, a hum of life that felt almost irrelevant to him now. He walked with the same precision that defined his entire career, moving forward without needing anything from the world around him, there were no crowds cheering, no applause for his actions in the courtroom. He had already known that would be the case. Will was never one for fanfare. He had been trained to remain composed, to stand firm when others faltered, to act when the moment required it. What mattered to him was the quiet certainty that he had done what was right. And in the courtroom, that was exactly what he had done. As he moved further into the city, the light began to fade, and the mist turned to a heavier fog. Will didn't mind. The fog didn't bother him, just like the noise of the city didn't distract him. It was all part of the world, but it didn't define him. He was a man who had learned to find peace within himself, to stand unshaken amid the chaos. He paused at a crossing, looking up at the gray sky. There was a certain stillness to it, a quiet after the storm, and Will felt that same peace settle within him. He had always known his role, to serve, to protect, to act when necessary, and to remain silent when that was required. His life had been defined by those principles, and even now, nothing had changed. There was no external validation required. He had already given everything he needed to, and he had done it without hesitation. The case was behind him, the trial over, and yet, nothing in his demeanor had changed. He was still the same man who had entered the courtroom that morning, silent, steady, and resolute. As the light dimmed further and the fog thickened, Will took a deep breath, steadying himself for whatever would come next. In a world that seemed to demand more from its people every day, there was something powerful about the stillness, something that reminded him that true strength didn't always come from loud declarations, but from the quiet resilience to keep moving forward. Will's steps carried him forward, as measured and precise as they had always been. By the time he reached the steps of the barracks, the fog had fully enveloped the city, casting everything in a soft, muted light. The sounds of London had dimmed, replaced by the solitude of the evening. He was alone, as always, but that didn't bother him. Will had never needed the company of others to define himself. He had always been enough, just as he was. He paused at the entrance, looking up at the familiar walls of the barracks. The life he had known, quiet, duty-bound, and unassuming, was about to continue, as it always did. He could already hear the shuffle of guardsmen inside, getting ready for the night's duty. His presence would be felt by those who knew him, but he wouldn't seek out acknowledgement. It wasn't his way. The day's events had been a reminder of the legacy that hung over him, the quiet duty that had been passed down from his brother, Lieutenant Arthur Hartley. His brother had acted in the heat of battle, disobeying orders to save others, and he had died for it. But that sacrifice lived on, and it would continue to live on through Will. The name Hartley, once again, had proven its weight, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices made in the face of adversity. As Will stood there, the sounds of the barracks growing clearer as the men inside continued their routines, he knew that he would carry that legacy forever. He had stood in the courtroom not as a soldier, not as a guard, but as a man whose actions spoke for themselves. He had done what was right when the moment demanded it, and in doing so, he had lived up to the legacy of those who had gone before him. Without a word, Will stepped forward, the doors of the barracks opening with a soft creak as he entered. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The world outside would continue to turn, the fog would lift, and life would carry on. But in his own quiet way, Will Hartley had made his statement, and it would endure, just as the name Hartley had always done. There was no need for recognition, no need for applause. Will simply moved forward, because in a world that often demanded more, sometimes the most powerful statement one could make was to do the right thing. Quietly, without seeking anything in return. And that was exactly what he had done. Appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video.